Hello, and welcome back to the Easter Historian's Bedtime Stories. I'm Jason. Today, we're telling the complete story of Atlantis. Imagine a civilization so wealthy at its height that it seemed mythical, so powerful that it commanded vast fleets, harbors, plains, and kingdoms. And then, in the span of a single day and night, vanished beneath the sea. What makes a story like that fascinating is not simply the word sank. Every disaster is only the final act. The most interesting part always comes before it. How a civilization was born, how it grew from a fertile island into a maritime empire, and how, at the very moment everyone believed it was reaching its peak, it slowly lost the restraint that had once defined it and pushed itself toward a point of no return. That is the full story of Atlantis. Today, we are not going to talk about crystal power, flying machines, or prehistoric super technology added later by movies and occult traditions. We're not going to dress speculation up as history. We will follow the earliest surviving ancient account and reconstruct Atlantis as it was actually described. You will see that it was not evil from the beginning, and it certainly was not destroyed because its technology was too advanced. Quite the opposite. At first, Atlantis was given almost every advantage a civilization could possibly want. The real question is this: when a country lacks nothing, what can it still be missing? More than 2,400 years ago, the Athenians had already seen great powers rise, and they had seen great powers fail. War, coups, collapsing alliances, and imperial ambition were not distant legends to them. In that world, an even older story was told. According to the tale, a visitor in Egypt once heard an elderly priest speak about a past the Greeks had long forgotten. The priest told him that human beings think their memories reach far back, but in truth, human memory is short. Floods, earthquakes, fires, and other disasters destroy cities again and again. Survivors may remain alive, but they do not always carry writing, archives, and history with them. When civilization is rebuilt, later generations may still remember the names of a few gods and scattered heroes, while having no idea what happened in the world that came before. That opening matters because it gives the entire Atlantis story a peculiar atmosphere. It does not say, "Here is an imaginary kingdom." It says, "Here is a forgotten history." The priest then claims that roughly 9,000 years before the age of Solon, the Greek world faced a vast power that came from the Western Ocean. Its center lay beyond the Pillars of Heracles, what we generally understand today as the Strait of Gibraltar. Beyond the strait, he said, stood an enormous island. Beyond were other islands, and farther still, a greater outer ocean. The nation on that island possessed a formidable fleet, controlled large territories around it, and pushed its power through the strait into the Mediterranean world. Its name was Atlantis, but do not picture underwater ruins yet. At this point, Atlantis had not sunk. In fact, it did not even have a city. The story moves farther back to the beginning of everything. When the gods divided the earth among themselves, Poseidon, god of the sea, received this island in the ocean. Near its center stood a low hill. On that hill lived a mortal couple with a daughter named Cleito. Poseidon fell in love with her. To protect her from intrusion, he carved a series of alternating rings of land and water around the hill, enclosing the center like nested circles. Cleito lived on the innermost height. Around it came a ring of water, then a ring of land, then another ring of water. These rings were not originally designed for ships. They were barriers built for isolation. Poseidon also caused two springs to rise from the ground, one warm and one cool, and made the surrounding land fertile. And so the first heart of Atlantis appeared, a sacred center surrounded by rings of land and water, two inexhaustible springs, and a broad expanse of rich soil capable of feeding generations to come. The beginning almost seems too perfect. Atlantis did not begin in exile. It did not endure famine. It did not have to rebuild from the ruins of war. It was a country handed the best possible starting position. And the more perfect that beginning seems, the harsher the ending becomes. If Atlantis failed later, it would be difficult to blame bad luck. Poseidon and Cleito had 5 pairs of twin sons, 10 sons in all. The island was divided into 10 kingdoms, and each son received his own territory and throne. The eldest, Atlas, received the most important central region and became the supreme king above the other 9. The island and the surrounding ocean came to be associated with his name. These 10 kingdoms were not separate and unrelated states. They shared a common ancestry, religion, and legal tradition. The descendants of Atlas held the highest rank, but the other royal houses governed their own lands, populations, and armies. From the beginning, then, Atlantis was not simply a city. It was a federation of kingdoms. The earliest generations of kings ruled very differently from those who came later. They possessed wealth, but they were not obsessed with it. They possessed power, but they accepted that power had to obey rules. What mattered in their eyes was order, restraint, and trust among the kingdoms. Gold and silver were merely the result of prosperity, not the purpose of the state. The 10 kingdoms met regularly to discuss common affairs. Their laws were not preserved only through oral tradition. They were engraved on a sacred pillar in the central sanctuary of Poseidon. The kings were required to acknowledge that some rules were older and higher than their own commands. At appointed times, all 10 kings gathered for a sacred ritual. First they prayed to the sea god, then together they captured a bull. The sacrificial animal was brought before the pillar on which the laws were engraved, and its blood flowed over the rules left by their ancestors. The kings then drank wine mixed with the blood of the sacrifice and swore before the god that they would never knowingly violate the law and would never obey an order that required them to break it. As the sacrificial fire died down, they changed into dark robes, sat around the embers, and judged disputes among themselves. In other words, the most precious thing in early Atlantis was not a metal-covered wall or a giant fleet. It was a simple principle that is extraordinarily difficult to preserve over generations. Even the most powerful people must know what they are not allowed to do. The law also restricted the 10 kingdoms from going to war with one another. If one royal house suffered a serious internal crisis, the others were expected to help resolve it rather than exploit the situation and seize its territory. Major wars, alliances, and royal disputes had to be discussed collectively by the 10 kings. The purpose was obvious: to prevent a vast state made up of 10 dynasties and 10 military systems from tearing itself apart from within. For a long time, it worked. And because Atlantis remained internally stable, it could direct its energy towards something else: building. At first, the concentric rings of land and water were only natural barriers. Later, the kings began constructing bridges to connect the central zone with the outer land. Then they cut a great canal from the sea so ocean-going ships could enter the outermost ring of water. After that, They opened channels between the different circular harbors and left passages beneath the bridges wide enough for vessels to pass through. What had once been a system designed to keep the world out slowly became an extraordinarily complex port. This transformation is important. Atlantis was first protected by water. Later, it used water to connect itself to the world. Imagine a merchant ship arriving in Atlantis for the first time. Coming in from the open sea, it enters a long, broad, straight canal. On either side stand embankments, warehouses, and crowds of workers. Farther ahead, instead of an ordinary harbor basin, the ship encounters an enormous circular waterway. It passes beneath a bridge and enters the next ring-shaped harbor. The closer it gets to the center, the taller the buildings become, the heavier the security grows, and the more brilliantly the metal-clad walls shine. At the very center stand the royal palace and the sanctuary of Poseidon. This was not simply a city built by the sea. The sea itself had been drawn into the city structure. During construction, white, black, and red stone was quarried from beneath the island. Some walls were built in a single color, while others used the three stones in alternating patterns. The outer wall was covered in a metal resembling bronze or copper. Another was plated with tin, and the wall closest to the center was faced with the material that later became one of Atlantis's most famous mysteries, orichalcum. The ancient account says only that it was extremely valuable, second only to gold, and that it had a striking luster. Later writers gave it mysterious properties, describing it as an energy source or a key to lost technology. But in the earliest story, it is simply a precious metal. What made Atlantis extraordinary was not supernatural machinery. It was the way it pushed engineering, resources, and organization, things ancient people could understand, to their imagined limits. The buildings around the royal palace became grander with every generation. Each king seemed determined not to be outdone by the one before him. Palaces expanded, temples became richer, and the center of the city grew ever more magnificent. The most impressive structure was the Temple of Poseidon. Silver, gold, ivory, and precious metals were used on a vast scale. A colossal statue of Poseidon stood inside, the god driving a chariot and surrounded by divine figures of the sea. Golden statues representing the descendants of the 10 royal houses stood nearby. Tribute from across the empire flowed into this place, compressing kingship, religion, and wealth into one sacred center. Anyone who entered would have understood immediately that this was not the temple of an ordinary city-state. It was the heart of power in a maritime empire. But Atlantis did not spend all of its resources on display. The hot and cold springs were channeled into bathing facilities, some for the royal family, some for ordinary people, and even some for animals. Excess water irrigated gardens and other areas. Around the central city stood training grounds, a race course, military barracks, and homes. Water here was not decoration. It served daily life, agriculture, transportation, and the military. A natural landscape, said to have been created by a god, was gradually transformed by generations of people into an increasingly sophisticated urban system. What made the city truly impressive was the way everything connected. The mountains provided water and timber. The plain produced food. Canals carried goods. Harbors received foreign materials. Trade accumulated wealth. Wealth funded shipbuilding and the army. The military, in turn, protected shipping routes and territories. Atlantis was not advanced because any single technology was bizarre. Its real sophistication lay in coordinating ordinary capabilities at the scale of an entire state. Bring the camera down to street level, and the prosperity of Atlantis suddenly feels much more real. The first place to wake in the morning is not the palace. It is the harbor. Merchant ships arriving from the open sea ride the tide and wind into the main channel. Pilots shout instructions from ashore. Dock workers loosen lines. Warehouse clerks begin counting cargo. Timber is unloaded in one place, grain in another. Metal ore is taken to workshops. Spices, oils, and textiles from distant places are loaded onto carts. Crowds move constantly across the bridges. Small boats shuttle through the waterways. From the shipyards in the distance comes the pounding sound of wood being worked. This is not a silent, mythical city. It is a port metropolis whose noise and scale would overwhelm a stranger on the very first day. As you move toward the center, the sound changes. The outer areas belong to merchant ships, warehouses, and craftsmen. The middle rings contain houses, barracks, training grounds, and the racecourse. The closer you get to the innermost zone, the stronger the presence of religion and political power becomes. An ordinary merchant might spend an entire career in the outer harbor without ever approaching the palace. Soldiers and officials could cross more bridges. Priests and members of the royal families controlled access to the sacred center. The concentric structure of the city was not only an architectural wonder. It was also a map of social hierarchy drawn directly onto the ground. At the center stood gods and kingship. Around them came military life, ordinary life, and trade. Beyond there were agriculture and resources. Only then came the empire's territories and the wider world. Living in a city designed this way would have created a very particular feeling. Anyone in Atlantis would always know how far they stood from the center. Every day, you could see the great buildings of the innermost ring. You could watch tribute, soldiers, and envoys moving toward them. Wealth flowed inward from across the island, and orders flowed outward from the center. The city was not merely transporting goods. It was constantly reinforcing an idea. Every road ultimately led toward royal power, and all royal power ultimately came from the order established by the sea god. The mountains played their role in this system as well. They held forests, wild animals, and water sources. Timber moved down rivers and artificial channels toward the plain and the capital. Building a single warship required a large supply of high-quality wood. A vast fleet required forest management, felling, transportation, seasoning, construction, and repair to continue year after year. If Atlantis truly possessed more than 1,000 warships, as the story claims, then behind every vessel stood not one tree, but an entire resource network kept in constant motion. Details like this are what make its power feel less like an empty boast. The island was also said to contain large numbers of animals, including elephants. Later, that detail encouraged people to search for Atlantis by looking at animal geography. But within the story, it serves a simpler purpose, to show that the island was rich enough to support even very large animals. The mountains had vegetation, the plains had grain, water was abundant, and both wild and domesticated animals could thrive. From the beginning, Atlantis is deliberately described as a land with almost no natural weakness. It did not need conquest to survive. Even without taking anything from anyone else, it already had enough. That point is crucial because when Atlantis later chooses expansion, it cannot say, "We had to conquer or we would starve." It already has grain, metal, forests, and trading harbors. Expansion is not a survival instinct. It begins to look more and more like desire for its own sake. Once a country that lacks nothing begins demanding more from the outside world, the moral direction of the story becomes clear. The hot and cold springs reinforce this same abundance. Warm water can be used for bathing, cold water for daily needs, and both are distributed to gardens and other facilities. For an ancient city, water was almost synonymous with life. Entire wars could revolve around access to it. Atlantis, however, seems to have received one of the most valuable urban resources from the start. It does not need to fight over a well. It does not have to drive people away during drought. Even livestock have dedicated water. Plato's imagined Atlantis has almost every natural limitation removed, leaving one question behind. If the external conditions are this favorable, could human beings themselves become the greatest danger? The expansion of the royal palace begins changing the character of the city in quieter ways. The original central hill had simply been the place where Poseidon protected Cleito. Over generations, however, it becomes something like an architectural competition. One king builds a new hall, the next enlarges it. One generation covers a wall in precious metal. The next looks for something even more dazzling. Each addition can be justified as devotion to the gods, respect for the ancestors, or a display of national strength. But once surpassing the previous generation becomes a tradition, architecture itself teaches the rulers a new value. Greatness must be visible, and preferably larger than it was before. So the sanctuary that began as protection for one family gradually becomes the empire's greatest display of power. The more tribute arrives, the easier it becomes for the royal houses to see distant wealth flowing toward the capital as something natural. The taller the statues and the larger the palace, the easier it becomes for rulers to treat the distance between themselves and ordinary people as inevitable. Splendor does not automatically create arrogance, but it constantly reminds those in power that they stand above everyone else. The most dangerous changes often begin in that kind of visual lesson, repeated every single day. At the same time, the busier the harbor becomes, the more deeply Atlantis is connected to the outside world. In the beginning, the island's own resources are enough. Later, merchant ships constantly bring foreign goods home. Elites become accustomed to imported luxuries. The palace becomes accustomed to tribute from subject territories. The city becomes increasingly dependent on a vast commercial network. The farther the routes extend, the larger the map becomes, and the less the ocean feels like a boundary. It begins to look like a road without an end. Every successful voyage makes the next, longer voyage seem reasonable. Every new port drawn into the sphere of influence makes the next port seem less distant. That is one of the most subtle features of a maritime empire. A land power sees mountains and deserts and naturally senses borders. A sea power sees the horizon. If ships can reach a place, it can become a market. Once it becomes a market, it may need protection. Once it needs protection, troops may be stationed there. Once troops are stationed there, obedience may be demanded. Trade and expansion are never automatically the same thing. But when a country possesses both a powerful fleet and a growing appetite, the distance between them becomes shorter and shorter. Leave the royal city and travel farther outward, and you finally reach the thing that truly supports the empire, the enormous plain. It is described as exceptionally vast, with mountains around its edges. A great canal is cut around the perimeter, while straight channels divide the interior. Timber from the mountains can flow downstream, and farm produce can be loaded directly onto boats bound for the city. Winter agriculture depends on rainfall, while summer crops are supported by irrigation. The land is said to yield 2 harvests a year. For an ancient state that is close to an agricultural dream, food determines population. Population supports armies. Timber makes ships. Metal makes tools and weapons. Water determines whether cities can survive in the long term. Atlantis seems to have all of them. The resource bottlenecks that limited most ancient states are almost absent. It becomes easier to understand how this country could support a huge population, construct a complex capital, and still maintain expeditionary armies and a fleet. Its strength did not appear overnight. It accumulated canal by canal, field by field, warehouse by warehouse. The plain was also divided into numerous military and administrative districts. Each parcel of land carried not only agricultural obligations, but military ones. Some districts were responsible for chariots, others for cavalry, others for heavily armed infantry, light troops, or sailors. At the height of the empire, the Navy is described as numbering 1,200 warships. Whether that figure is exaggerated matters less than what the description is trying to convey. Atlantis had a system for sustained mobilization. It was not simply grabbing whoever happened to be available when war began. Land, population, and military responsibility had already been built into the structure of the state. A country that can fight only one war is not especially frightening. What matters is the ability to keep replacing food, timber, ships, soldiers, and horses, allowing war to continue for years. That is where Atlantis is portrayed as strongest. Plains, forests, harbors, kingdoms, and fleets are connected in one network, and that gives the state an extremely dangerous capacity. If its rulers change direction, the entire society can change direction with them. For a long time, that capacity remains restrained. The early kings understand that wealth is a tool. They can possess gold and silver without treating them as honor in themselves. They can command armies without believing those armies must always expand outward. Because of that restraint, early prosperity does not immediately become imperial ambition. Atlantis is powerful, but it still knows where the boundary lies. The relationship among the 10 kings may be the most remarkable achievement of early Atlantis. 10 hereditary dynasties, each with land, armies, and wealth, could easily have fought over succession, borders, or advantage. Yet the system inherited from their ancestors required them to bring disputes to the shared sanctuary. Kings were allowed to disagree. They were not allowed to turn every disagreement into a war. For an alliance of 10 kingdoms, that kind of restraint is harder to build than a palace. A palace needs stone and labor. Restraint requires every generation of rulers to accept that their power has limits. That is why the ritual of the 10 kings is more than an exotic religious ceremony. It repeatedly explains why the alliance still exists. Capturing the bull, letting its blood run over the pillar of law, drinking together, judging disputes beside the embers. These acts remind every king that he is not an isolated supreme authority. He belongs to an order older and larger than himself. As long as that belief survives, competition among the 10 kingdoms can remain contained. But institutions have a weakness. They do not automatically preserve the spirit that created them. The founders personally experienced the birth of the state and understood why the rules were necessary. Later generations are born into a world in which those rules already exist. Order becomes something they take for granted. The first generation fears civil war and values common law. A fifth or 10th generation may never have seen the alliance come close to collapse and may have little instinctive understanding of why their ancestors were so cautious. Many institutions become most vulnerable not when they are new, but after they have succeeded for too long. Success itself can make people forget why success was possible. The first thing to change may not be the law at all. It may simply be the way people live. The palace grows larger. Banquets become more extravagant. Tribute from every direction increases. Noble children are born into wealth and never experience the process their ancestors did, receiving riches while still learning not to value them too highly. To them, gold and silver are not unexpected resources. They're simply what the world is supposed to send to the center. Learning restraint in poverty is not especially difficult. The harder test is knowing restraint when you have never lacked anything. That change spreads through the rest of society. Merchants discover that a larger empire means more markets. Shipowners see new routes as new profits. Soldiers see war as a path to glory. Officials see new territories as new positions to govern. Everyone can find a personal reason to support the same direction. No one has to say, "We are becoming greedy," because desire can always be given a more respectable name. More trade becomes prosperity. A larger military becomes security. Distant garrisons become protection of shipping lanes. More territory becomes the maintenance of order. When everyone can benefit from moving in the same direction, the person who questions that direction begins to look strange. Someone who says the kingdom should stop may be called timid. Someone who asks whether further expansion is necessary may be accused of not understanding the national interest. Past victories provide constant evidence in favor of going farther. Look, we did it last time. We won, and we became richer. Success itself becomes the argument for the next gamble. By this point, the army is no longer merely a defensive instrument. The military obligations built into the plain allow huge numbers of people to be mobilized quickly. Harbors concentrate manpower. Fleets transport armies across the sea. Once the palace decides on an expedition, a complete system already exists to carry the order from decision to departure. The danger of an institutionalized military is not only that it fights well. It makes war easier to begin. What once required emergency recruitment can now be started simply by activating machinery that already exists. The shipyard change as expansion grows. At first, ships are built for trade and coastal defense. Later, new territories require more patrols, and more patrols require more warships. More ships mean more timber, more rowers, more repair bases, and more harbors. Once a fleet reaches a certain size, it begins to create demands of its own. A state that has invested enormous resources in maintaining a navy can easily begin asking whether that navy should be put to greater use. Power looks for a purpose, and that becomes another reason Atlantis finds it harder to stop. Eventually, the very coordination among the 10 kings that had once prevented civil war becomes a major advantage in foreign expansion. The kingdoms no longer waste their strength fighting one another. They concentrated on common targets. The plains provide food. The mountains provide timber. The mines provide metal. The kingdoms provide soldiers. The central harbor gathers everything together. One of the greatest institutional achievements of Atlantis is preserved completely. Only its purpose changes from maintaining order to increasing power. That is why the decline of Atlantis is not described as simple chaos. In fact, it may become more administratively capable at the same time that it becomes more morally dangerous. Roads do not disappear. Taxes do not stop. Shipyards do not close. The military does not collapse. Everything may actually become more efficient. What changes is the goal. A country moving in the right direction inefficiently may move slowly. A country moving in the wrong direction with extraordinary efficiency can reach disaster much faster. As its influence spreads outward, Atlantis encounters a problem almost every empire faces. What do you do with places you have newly acquired? If the troops withdraw, earlier investments may be lost. If troops remain, they need bases, harbors, and supplies. Once bases exist, the territory around those bases must be protected. Protecting the surrounding territory then becomes an argument for additional control. Every expansion creates new security needs, and those new security needs become reasons for further expansion. Eventually, Atlantis stops looking at the Strait of Gibraltar as the edge of the world and starts seeing it as a doorway. An empire has already taken shape outside the strait. Inside lies the Mediterranean. Once, passing through that narrow entrance might have meant trade or exploration. Now means pushing the full power of the empire into a new political world. This is the true threshold. The state moves from we must protect what we already possess to we must control what does not yet belong to us. But the most dangerous changes never arrive with trumpets announcing themselves. No king stands before the people and declares, "From this day forward, we no longer respect our ancestors." Change happens slowly. One generation believes a slightly larger palace is harmless. The next considers richer decoration a matter of national dignity. The third begins to treat more tribute as proof of higher status. By the fourth, it is difficult to understand why the ancestors ever regarded gold as something unimportant. Each change, viewed by itself, looks like progress. The harbor is busier. The palaces are grander. The territories are larger. The military is stronger. Every number you can measure seems to be rising. But one thing is falling, and it is the hardest thing to see: restraint. The early kings believed that more wealth brought greater responsibility. Later rulers increasingly believe that more wealth proves they deserve more. The difference between those two ideas seems small. But once they are reversed, the direction of the entire state changes. At first, the sea is transportation and trade. Later, it becomes a sphere of influence. At first, the fleet protects shipping. Later, the fleet itself becomes a reason to expand. At first, distant territories may be allies or trading partners. Later, more and more places are brought under Atlantean control. The larger the empire becomes, the more borders it must defend. The more borders it must defend, the farther outward it feels compelled to control. Expansion slowly becomes self-reinforcing. A country is often most likely to misjudge itself, not after repeated defeats, but after repeated victories. Failure forces people to question themselves. Victory makes them believe previous choices have been proven correct. Atlantis becomes richer, its influence spreads, and its navy appears in more distant waters. Eventually, a question that should be asked again and again stops being asked at all. Just because we can do something, does that mean we should? That is the boundary Atlantis truly crosses. It does not suddenly become insane. It simply begins to translate "we are capable" into "we are entitled." Once that belief reaches the palace, every advantage accumulated over centuries is given a new use. Granaries remain full, but now they feed expeditionary armies. Shipyards keep building, but not only for trade. The 10 kings still coordinate, but now they coordinate foreign wars. The plain still produces harvests, but increasingly it becomes the logistical base of a war machine. The institutions have not collapsed. They may be functioning better than ever. Only the purpose has changed. That may be the most unsettling part of the entire Atlantis story. Civilizations do not always decline through crumbling streets, empty treasuries, and deserting soldiers. Sometimes the most dangerous phase comes while every institution is still working efficiently. The harbor is busier than before. Revenue is higher. The fleet is stronger. Ordinary people may even believe they are living in the greatest age of their country. But if the whole system has begun serving limitless desire, then greater efficiency only makes it more dangerous. Atlantis finally pushes through the strait and into the Mediterranean world. Its power advances along North Africa and toward Europe. No longer satisfied with the islands and coasts outside the strait, it prepares to overwhelm the major powers within it in a single campaign. By this point, war is no longer an accidental clash. It is an expedition intended to reshape an entire region. Atlantis believes its fleet, population, and resources are enough to turn this into one more victory. Once preparations begin, the rhythm of the entire empire changes. Docks that normally handle commercial goods give priority to military supplies. Shipyards rush to repair warships. Soldiers are called up from the plains under the established service system. Horses and chariots move toward assembly points. Men from all 10 kingdoms travel along roads and waterways toward the harbors. The same routes that once made merchants rich now carry armies. Centuries of construction in a maritime empire suddenly point toward one purpose: war. For the people living through it, this may not feel like the eve of catastrophe at all. It may feel like the proudest moment in their history. Harbors are packed with ships. Rituals are held at the palace. Kings announce the objectives of the campaign. Young men see departure as an honor. Merchants imagine new markets. Too many past victories have convinced too many people that this time will be no different. The most dangerous decisions are often made when confidence is at its highest. Standing against Atlantis is a very different society. Ancient Athens. This is not a state archaeology has confirmed existed 9,000 years before Plato. It is an idealized Athens within the story. It does not possess the extravagant wealth of Atlantis, but it is defined by discipline, training, public duty, and restraint. It does not rule a vast empire of 10 kings, but it is described as internally cohesive. The conflict is therefore more than the collision of two armies. It is the collision of two political logics. One side believes wealth, population, and fleets determine the outcome. The other is portrayed as resisting through order and courage. Atlantis appears to have almost no reason to lose. Its expeditionary capacity is greater, its logistics more complete, its sphere of control larger. But that is precisely the contrast the story wants. The more impossible defeat seems, the more powerful the reversal becomes. Once war begins, most of the details are lost. We do not know where the fleets first met, where troops landed, or which commander led the charge. But the most important outcome survives. At first, Athens did not fight alone. It led other regions in resistance. Later, those allies withdrew or lost the ability to continue, leaving Athens almost alone against Atlantis. At the moment when every condition seems to favor the stronger empire, the result reverses. Ancient Athens defeats Atlantis. The seemingly unstoppable fleet is halted. Imperial expansion stops. Territories already brought under control are freed. For the first time, Atlantis suffers a defeat that truly matters. Confidence built over decades, or even centuries, is shattered in a single campaign. But if you think the story ends as nothing more than a great power was defeated, it does not. The final blow that turns Atlantis into an eternal legend has not yet arrived. For an empire accustomed to winning, the first genuine defeat can be more dangerous than it would be for an ordinary state. An ordinary state knows it has limits. Atlantis has gone too long without taking that idea seriously. Its harbors have taught it that resources can always flow inward. Its fleet has taught it that distant places can always be reached. Its territories have taught it that borders can always move outward. When ancient Athens finally stops that logic, the defeat strikes not only the army, but the empire's image of itself. Imagine the warships returning to harbor. The mood is completely different from the day they left. Before departure, the docks may have been filled with banners, sacrifice, and cheering. Now ships return damaged. Some rowing benches are empty. Wounded men are carried down from the decks. Gaps appear in what had once been an orderly fleet. The expedition does not bring back more tribute. It brings back a message Atlantis has not heard in a very long time. There are forces in the world that cannot simply conquer. For the palace, the defeat immediately raises another problem. The 10 kingdoms have been united by shared victories. How will they share responsibility for failure? Who underestimated the enemy? Which kingdom failed to provide what was expected? Which squadron retreated first? Which subject territories might now consider rebellion? Plato's surviving story does not describe these political consequences, and we should not invent a detailed civil conflict that is not in the text. But a federation this large, after a major defeat, would inevitably face pressures that did not exist during uninterrupted success. The irony is that Atlantis was originally designed to handle internal conflict better than almost anything else. The system of 10 kings existed precisely to make power submit to common law. But by this point, the real question is no longer whether the kings can hold a meeting. It is whether the men attending the meetings still possess the restraint of their ancestors. The institutions may still exist. The rituals may still be performed. But if each ruler is now more concerned with status, wealth, and blame, the same procedures no longer carry the same force. That is why the story places Atlantis' moral decline before the war, not after it. Atlantis does not become corrupt because it loses. It becomes corrupt first, and the war exposes what has changed. A state that has grown used to solving problems through power discovers its hidden weakness only when power suddenly stops working. In that sense, the victory of ancient Athens is a crack in the surface. The magnificent shell of Atlantis breaks for the first time, but its walls still stand. The harbors remain. The palace remains. The plane continues to produce. If the story ended here, Atlantis might reorganize, rebuild the fleet, and return a few years later. One defeat does not automatically destroy an empire. What eliminates the possibility of a second chance is the natural catastrophe that follows almost immediately. And the disaster becomes so powerful precisely because it leaves Atlantis no time to recover. The military defeat has already shaken the state. Then the earth itself begins to shake. For a city dependent on precise waterways and harbor systems, an earthquake is not an ordinary threat. Bridges, embankments, docks, warehouses, and tall buildings are directly exposed. Worse still, the sea is already inside the city. In normal times, that is the source of its wealth. In a catastrophe, it means there is almost no buffer between the city and the water. A major earthquake rarely ends in a single instant. After the first shock may come aftershocks. The ground may crack. Some districts may subside. Harbor water levels can change unpredictably. Ancient people had no warning systems and no modern structural engineering. They could flee buildings, seek higher ground, and interpret the sea according to whatever experience they had. But the heart of Atlantis itself sits inside a complicated set of water rings. The design the city was proudest of could make escape more difficult during an extreme disaster. If a tsunami follows, the situation becomes even more chaotic. In deep water, a tsunami does not necessarily look like a towering wall. But as it enters shallow seas and harbors, the water rises and powerful currents develop. Narrow channels, harbor entrances, and artificial canals could make the flow faster and more unpredictable. Ships break free from their moorings and collide. Timber and building debris become new projectiles. If bridges fail, the rings of land that have been connected to one another become isolated islands again. At that point, the rings first created by Poseidon take on an almost cruel reversal. They were originally meant to protect Cleito. Human beings later opened them up and turned them into the arteries of a thriving city. In disaster, those same channels could allow seawater to rush rapidly toward the center. Protection, prosperity, and destruction all become tied to the same system of water. Atlantis has been bound to water from the beginning. No one simply knew how the water would return in the end. The palace and the temple cannot escape the shaking simply because they are sacred. Metal-covered walls, colossal statues, and high roofs mean majesty in ordinary times. In an earthquake, they also mean weight. Ordinary people in the markets are not safe because they live far from power, and members of the royal family are not protected because they live at the center. One of the cruelties of natural disaster is that it does not recognize human hierarchy. A person may spend a lifetime trying to move closer to the innermost ring, but on that day, the innermost and outermost rings are simply pieces of ground that are shaking. The Great Plain would not be spared either. If the major canals broke, rivers and irrigation networks could spill out of control, flooding low-lying farmland. Once roads and bridges were damaged, people outside the city could not easily get in, while people inside might struggle to reach distant high ground. A society made efficient by extreme interconnection faces a different kind of danger when many systems fail at once. Every part depends on another part, so damage in one place can spread rapidly through the whole network. We do not know whether the catastrophe lasted several hours, or whether there was one distinct tsunami. The surviving ancient ending simply speaks of violent earthquakes and floods, and says that Atlantis disappeared in a single terrible day and night. Because the details are missing, the safest approach is not to invent a movie scene. It is to let what we already know about the city structure show us why such a disaster could have been so destructive. Perhaps the hardest thing to imagine is that most people in the city would not have known they were living through the last day of a civilization. When the first shock struck, they may have thought only of where their families were, whether their houses would collapse, and when the next aftershock might come. A dock worker would not know that people 2,000 years later would be searching for his city. A soldier would not know his country was about to become a legend. To them, this was not history. It was simply a day that had suddenly stopped making sense. Once seawater actually covered the streets, the symbols of Atlantis lost all meaning. Metal-clad walls could not stop the ocean. A pillar of law could not order the earth to stop shaking. A fleet could not fight an entire sea. For decades, perhaps centuries, the empire had proved again and again that it could control more and more rivers, land, trade, territories, armies. In the end, it met a force it could not control at all. The story says that after that terrible day and night, the island vanished beneath the sea. The surrounding waters were left choked with mud and became difficult to navigate. No surviving fleet returned to rebuild. No second capital inherited the empire. No continuous king list preserved the descendants of the 10 royal houses. In narrative terms, this is not an ordinary political collapse. It is a complete exit from the world. A war can leave ruins. A conquest can leave a new ruler. But if the island itself disappears, there is no obvious next chapter for the civilization that lived on it. That is one reason Atlantis creates more mystery than places like Troy, Babylon, or other ancient cities. Real cities, even when destroyed, often leave mounds, foundations, and later inhabitants. Atlantis is described as sinking into the sea. It is not waiting beneath the soil for archaeologists to uncover it. It is placed in one of the environments humans have the greatest difficulty observing directly. The ocean destroys the city in the story, and at the same time gives the legend an almost limitless hiding place. From that moment on, Atlantis no longer belongs only to its own age. It belongs to everyone who comes later and searches for it. Every generation asks the same question. If a civilization this large really existed, could it truly leave no trace at all? And every time a submerged city, an ancient tsunami, or a strange seafloor formation is discovered somewhere in the world, the name Atlantis returns. After the military defeat, the ancient story lifts its attention from human beings to the gods. Atlantis began as a gift from the sea god and prospered while its rulers preserved restraint. By this point, however, it is said to have lost its original nobility. Zeus, king of the gods, sees what Atlantis has become and decides that the nation must be punished so that it can learn again what restraint means. The gods are summoned, and just as the final judgment appears ready to be pronounced, the surviving ancient text suddenly stops. This is one of the strangest features of the Atlantis story. We know the gods are preparing to judge the island, but the full judgment does not survive. We know destruction is coming, but we do not know how those final moments were originally described. There is no surviving last speech from the final king, no record of priests sounding an alarm, no account of ordinary citizens fleeing. The spectacular end of the world, scenes familiar from later movies and novels, are mostly inventions of later ages. The actual ancient ending that survives is extremely brief. Violent earthquakes and flood strikes suddenly. The earth moves. The sea becomes uncontrollable. In one terrible day and night, some of Athens's finest warriors also perish in disaster, while the enormous island of Atlantis sinks beneath the sea. The harbors once crowded with merchant ships and warships disappear. The ring-shaped waterways disappear. Palaces, temples, racecourses, warehouses, and homes all vanish from human sight. Mud and shoals are said to remain on the surface, making the area difficult to navigate. A civilization enlarged over many generations is reduced, in the story, to destruction completed in a single day. The most shocking thing is not the water. It is the time scale. A city takes decades to build. An empire takes generations to form. A system of 10 kings and an ocean-going fleet takes longer still. Atlantis gains almost everything through accumulation. One canal after another, one palace after another, one king after another. Then, at the end, centuries of addition are erased in a single day and night. That imbalance is what gives the story its lasting shadow. If we picture that final day, the outer harbor might be the first place to sense that something is wrong. Powerful shaking would put embankments, bridges, and buildings under enormous stress. Water in narrow canals and harbor basins could begin behaving unpredictably. The canal system that was one of the city's greatest achievements in ordinary times might become a path for water to drive farther inward during a disaster. Engineering designed to control water reveals another face once the forces exceed what it can withstand. But these are modern ways of helping us understand the possibilities. They are not eyewitness details preserved from antiquity. What we can say with confidence is limited to earthquakes, flooding, submergence, and the abrupt end of the story. And it is precisely because the ending leaves such a large blank that Atlantis gains a second life. The first storyline ends when the island sinks. The second begins only after it is gone. People begin asking, if it was really that large, where did it sink? If it existed, why are there not more records? Was the catastrophe connected to a real volcanic eruption, tsunami, or change in sea level? From that point forward, Atlantis is no longer just an ancient story. It becomes the object of search that lasts more than 2,000 years. At first, there is very little anyone can actually do. Ancient sailors are capable of passing through the Strait of Gibraltar, but the outer ocean remains huge and dangerous. There are no modern charts, no deep-sea surveys, and certainly no way to see terrain thousands of meters beneath the surface. For a long time, Atlantis exists only in texts and arguments. Some readers treat it as ancient history. Others see it more as a political and moral parable. But as long as the phrase "beyond the strait" remains in the story, the map seems to contain one unfinished space. Later, human knowledge of the world expands. Ocean voyages turn the Atlantic from a legendary frontier into a real route. The Americas enter European geography. Areas that were once blank on maps are crossed by one shipping lane after another. You might expect Atlantis to become harder to hide as the unknown shrinks. Instead, something almost opposite happens. The more the world is explored, the more people grow accustomed to the idea that ancient geographical claims that once sounded exaggerated might contain fragments of truth. People had once imagined there was nothing meaningful beyond the edge of the known sea, only to discover entire continents. So some began asking, If ancient knowledge of the world was incomplete, how can we be certain that a lost island described in an ancient story was entirely fictional? That attitude becomes even stronger in the modern era. Geology teaches people that mountains rise, coastlines move, and volcanoes destroy cities. Archaeology repeatedly uncovers sites that had once been known only through ancient texts and traditions. The Earth suddenly appears much older and far more capable of dramatic change than earlier generations imagined. Atlantis becomes attractive again because it no longer looks only like myth. It begins to look like a historical problem that perhaps has simply not been solved yet. In the late 19th century, the American writer Ignatius Donnelly pushes that imagination much further. He is not satisfied with treating Atlantis as a lost island. He turns it into a common source behind many ancient civilizations. In this version, Atlantis is not only rich and powerful, it possesses knowledge far beyond the rest of the world around it. After the catastrophe, some survivors flee to different regions and spread agriculture, architecture, religion, and other forms of culture. Suddenly, many unrelated problems in world history can be explained with a single name. The theory is enormously attractive. Egypt has pyramids, and the Americas have monumental pyramid-shaped structures, so perhaps both inherited them from Atlantis. Different cultures have flood traditions, so perhaps all of them remember the same catastrophe. Ancient peoples understood astronomy and navigation, so perhaps that knowledge came from the same group of Atlantean survivors. The lost civilization becomes a master key that seems capable of opening every lock. The harder an ancient achievement is to explain, the easier it is to pull it into the Atlantis story. But real history has a problem with master keys. It rarely works that way. Human beings in different regions can invent similar solutions to similar problems. If you want to build something tall, the lower structure naturally has to be broader. If you live beside rivers, floods become part of cultural memory. If you grow crops, you observe seasons and the sky. If you sail long distances, you have to study winds, stars, and currents. Civilizations certainly communicate and borrow from one another, but contact does not mean every important idea came from one vanished center. The more Atlantis is turned into the source of everything, the farther it moves away from the earliest story of 10 kings, harbors, war, and restraint. Popular culture, however, rarely gives up a useful legend. In the 20th century, Atlantis becomes increasingly entangled with mysticism. Some people begin to believe that what disappeared was not an ordinary ancient civilization at all, but a society with technology far beyond its time. If no vast conventional ruins are found, perhaps its technology was entirely different. If no continuous written record survives, perhaps its knowledge was preserved by secret groups. If geology does not support the sudden sinking of an entire continent, then the cause of destruction can be shifted toward more mysterious forces. And so Atlantis gradually acquires crystals, energy devices, psychic powers, and prehistoric super technology. Every age gives Atlantis its own idea of what the highest civilization should look like. The age of steam and electricity imagines lost machines. The nuclear age imagines immense energy sources. The information age gives it sophisticated knowledge networks. Atlantis becomes a blank canvas on which modern societies paint their own technological hopes and fears. Movies and novels make these images even more permanent. Deep underwater, we're shown glowing cities. Huge circular structures sit beneath transparent domes. Golden temples stand beside machines far beyond their supposed era. At the center, there's often some energy core keeping the whole civilization alive. Eventually, many people begin to assume these elements were part of the ancient story from the beginning. But when you return to the earliest account, none of them are there. No crystal power, no aircraft, no doomsday caused by a failed experiment. Almost all of the most famous science fiction elements were added later. That does not mean later imagination has no value. Quite the opposite. It shows how adaptable Atlantis has become. Ancient Greeks could use it to think about cities, power, and restraint. Modern writers used it to search for the origins of civilization. Industrial age culture transformed it into lost technology. Our own age often uses it to ask whether a highly technological civilization could destroy itself through its own abilities. The name keeps changing clothes, but one structure remains. A civilization of extraordinary prosperity crosses a boundary and suddenly loses everything. At the same time, real ocean science develops. People begin measuring the seafloor by more reliable methods rather than simply lowering weighted lines into the water. Underwater mountain ranges, trenches, and plains gradually appear on maps of the Atlantic. Sonar later allows ships to map submerged terrain continuously. Satellites and modern surveying reveal the ocean basins in even greater detail. Every improvement brings fresh hope. Perhaps this time, we will finally see Atlantis. Yet the clearer the seafloor becomes, the more obvious it is that the real ocean has complex structures of its own. Something that looks like a wall may be a fault. Something that resembles a road may be an artifact of survey lines. Something that looks like a platform may be volcanic or eroded rock. Nature has no obligation to look natural by human standards. It can produce straight lines, rings, steps, and regular-looking surfaces. The search for Atlantis, therefore, has to shift from what looks like a city to a much stricter question: where is the evidence that people lived for a long time? That brings the romantic search back to archaeological reality. A real city leaves traces of fire and cooking. It leaves animal bones, broken pottery, graves, roads, and walls that were repaired again and again. An empire leaves an even wider footprint. Long-distance trade goods, shared or interacting cultural styles, military installations, harbors, and systems for moving resources. A civilization is not simply a shape seen from above. It is layers upon layers of ordinary life accumulated in the ground. So whenever someone announces Atlantis has been found, the real investigation is only beginning. A circular landscape is only the first observation. After that, researchers have to excavate, date materials, analyze geology, identify whether structures are artificial, and allow other specialists to test the claims independently. A legend can be told in a minute. A site may take decades to understand. And because real research moves so slowly, Atlantis has developed a strange pattern in the internet age. Headlines announce that the mystery has been solved while the actual research is still saying, this may be worth investigating further. Atlantis is almost perfectly designed for this kind of cycle. Because there is no accepted location, any new discovery can briefly become the final answer. A volcanic island once sank. Atlantis. Concentric circles appear in a desert. Atlantis. Stone blocks are reported underwater. Atlantis again. The name works like a magnet. Whenever reality produces any two of the following, loss, submergence, rings, ancient cities, floods, the Atlantis story is quickly pulled toward it. But the longer the search continues, the clearer another problem becomes. People may not actually be searching for the same Atlantis. Some are looking for the giant empire described by Plato. Some are looking for a real catastrophe that inspired the story. Some are looking for a prehistoric island later submerged by the sea. Others are really searching for an imagined high-tech mother civilization. These four targets share the same name, but they require completely different kinds of evidence. Many debates never end because the two sides say Atlantis while searching for entirely different things. The real world does offer tempting echoes. Ancient Greeks were very familiar with earthquakes. In 373 BCE, the city of Helike on the northern coast of the Peloponnese was destroyed by a severe earthquake and an invasion of the sea. That happened close to Plato's own lifetime. So for his audience, the idea of a prosperous city being suddenly destroyed by earth and water was not science fiction. Reality had already shown that such a catastrophe could happen quickly. The earlier Aegean world offers an even more dramatic disaster. During the Bronze Age, the region around modern Santorini experienced a massive volcanic eruption. The settlement of Akrotiri was buried beneath thick volcanic deposits, and evidence of tsunami activity has been found in the surrounding area. Its buildings, wall paintings, and storage spaces show that Bronze Age island societies in the Aegean could be wealthy, complex, and deeply involved in long-distance trade. A maritime civilization, an island, and a catastrophic eruption. The combination naturally encourages later people to think of Atlantis. If you stood on the streets of Akrotiri before the eruption, you would not see a society of primitive people. You would see multi-story buildings, elaborate wall paintings, spaces for storing food and goods, and a community connected by sea to other islands and to Crete. The real Bronze Age Aegean was far more sophisticated than many people imagine. That is why, when volcanic ash sealed its streets, homes, and ordinary lives layer by layer, modern excavators experienced something emotionally similar to the discovery of a lost civilization. Atlantis is repeatedly linked to Santorini because of that emotional resemblance. A prosperous maritime society suddenly confronted by overwhelming natural forces. But once the details are compared carefully, serious problems appear. Santorini lies in the Aegean, not beyond the Strait of Gibraltar. The date of the eruption is nowhere near 9,000 years before Solon. The island is far smaller than the immense Atlantis described in the story. And Minoan civilization did not vanish completely on the day of the eruption. Santorini is extremely useful for understanding how a real catastrophe might enter ancient imagination, but that does not make it Atlantis. It is better understood as a real-world echo than as a confirmed prototype. The same logic applies to Helike. There truly was an earthquake and a destructive incursion of the sea, and ancient people did remember for a long time that a city had been taken by water. That kind of real experience could make any story about a sunken city feel believable. But Atlantis is much larger than Helike. It is not one city, but 10 kingdoms, a huge plain, and a transmarine empire. A real catastrophe can help explain one image in the story. It cannot automatically provide a birth certificate for the entire empire. Another group of searchers looks west of Gibraltar. Their reasoning is straightforward. If the story says the island lay outside the strait, that should be the first place to look. After the end of the last ice age, global sea level rose for a long period, covering many areas that had once been dry land. Shallow banks and former coastlines west of Gibraltar have therefore been proposed as possibilities. The date, the direction, and the theme of land lost to the sea overlap in ways that seem attractive. If we imagine today's map as permanently fixed, it is easy to underestimate why that idea is appealing. Over thousands and tens of thousands of years, coastlines move. During glacial periods, large amounts of water are locked in ice sheets on land, lowering global sea level. Areas that are shallow seas today can once have been dry ground. As the climate warms and ice melts, the sea gradually rises, drowning low plains and islands. For people living there, this is not a diagram in a geology textbook. It can become a story passed down through generations. A place a grandfather could walk across in his youth may require a boat by the time his grandchildren are grown. Experiences like that could absolutely produce old memories of land swallowed by the sea. A village does not have to vanish in a single night to become a legend generations later. That is why post-Ice Age sea level rise is so tempting when people see the Atlantis theme of lost land. But there is a major problem. Long-term sea level rise is usually gradual. It is not the same thing as an enormous island plunging into deep water in one day and night. The exposed areas later drowned by the sea also struggle to match the scale of the giant plain, 10 kingdoms, and great capital described in the story. They prove an important point. Coastlines 10,000 years ago were different, and human beings really have lost inhabited land to the sea. But lost land existed, and that land was Atlantis are still very different claims. Southwestern Spain has also attracted repeated attention. It lies near the ancient Western world beyond Gibraltar, in a region associated historically with metal trade and prosperous cultures. Some have suggested that memories of Western wealth, maritime trade, and disaster could have been recombined into the Atlantis tradition. This approach respects the story's original geography more closely than theories that place Atlantis on the other side of the planet. Even so, no archaeological site in Spain has gained broad acceptance as the confirmed Atlantis. What is most interesting here is not whether Spain is the final answer, but the fact that the Atlantis story already contains a strong Western imagination. For people in the Eastern Mediterranean, the world beyond Gibraltar represented the edge of the familiar. There were distant trade routes, valuable metals, and geographical reports that were difficult to verify. Placing a vast, wealthy state in that direction is similar to the way a modern story might place a secret installation in a remote ocean, close enough to reality to feel possible, far enough away to leave room for imagination. Another location, enormously popular online, lies in North Africa. From above, it displays a series of huge circular geological features that visually resemble the concentric city of Atlantis. Put two images side by side, add dramatic music, and it is easy for an audience to feel as though the mystery has finally been solved. But nature itself can produce ring-shaped geological formations. The giant circles there are the result of natural geological structures exposed and eroded over long periods, not a confirmed artificial harbor. More importantly, the concentric rings in the ancient story describe only the royal center of Atlantis, not the outline of the entire island. Resemblance in shape is nowhere near enough. And if Atlantis truly existed, it would have to leave much more than a beautiful outline. A real city of that scale would need evidence of long-term habitation, water supply, transportation, ports, dense human activity, production, trade, and a broad agricultural hinterland. A civilization does not leave only a pattern visible from a satellite, while leaving no life beneath the ground. Archaeology often depends on things far less glamorous than a mysterious circle. Pottery fragments, foundations, graves, tools, animal bones, charred seeds, and ordinary refuse. A real city cannot leave only a striking shape and no evidence of generations of daily life. A real empire with a massive fleet should also leave trade networks, harbor facilities, production sites, and evidence of cultural interaction. The great difficulty with Atlantis is that, so far, no complete chain of evidence like that has been found. The middle of the Atlantic has long seemed like the most obvious candidate of all. In the 19th century, people gradually learned that an enormous mountain system runs beneath the Atlantic Ocean. Many early writers immediately wondered whether it might be the remains of a sunken continent. The idea is intuitively appealing. The story says a great land sank in the Atlantic, and there are huge mountains on the seafloor. It seems as though the two simply need to be connected. Modern geology, however, tells us that the mid-Atlantic ridge is a zone where tectonic plates move apart and new oceanic crust forms. It is not the wreckage of a continent that suddenly sank 10,000 years ago. It is part of a process that has been reshaping the Earth for immense spans of time. In fact, the real geological story is larger than the legend. The Atlantic is not a static basin. Its seafloor slowly spreads. New crust forms near the ridge and moves outward to either side. The process is far too slow to notice in an ordinary human lifetime. Yet over tens and hundreds of millions of years, it changes an entire ocean. Once these mechanisms are understood, the traditional picture of a continent-sized island dropping thousands of meters into the sea in one night becomes increasingly difficult to reconcile with geology. Continental crust is not a stone raft floating on water that can simply fall away in an earthquake. Real regions can subside locally. Coastlines can change. Volcanic islands can collapse. But that is a very different scale from an island with a continent-sized plain disappearing into the deep ocean overnight. Science does not say that land never disappears. Islands can partially collapse. Coasts can sink. Volcanoes can reshape terrain. Sea level rise can cover vast lowlands. Science simply asks us to be precise about scale and mechanism. A coastal city destroyed by a tsunami is not the same thing as an enormous continent sinking suddenly. The partial collapse of a volcanic island is not the same as the disappearance of an empire built around a continental scale plain. The bigger Atlantis is claimed to be, the bigger the evidence must be. If someone truly announced the discovery of Atlantis one day, the most useful question would not be, does it look similar? It would be, do the pieces of evidence lock together? Is the site genuinely artificial? What is its date? Is there evidence of long-term settlement? Are the harbor and city large enough? Is there evidence for large-scale trade? Is there evidence for organized political power? Does the local geological disaster match the proposed destruction date? Most importantly, is there independent evidence, separate from the ancient story itself, that an unusually large maritime power actually existed there. Discoveries that transform history are rarely made from a single photograph. They emerge from many unimpressive pieces that slowly fit together. One wall built over another reveals construction phases. Charcoal can help establish a date. Pottery styles show trade and cultural contact. Animal bones and plant remains reveal diet. Sediment in an ancient harbor can reveal environmental change. When these pieces support one another, an ancient city can move from it looks like one to we can demonstrate that one existed here. What Atlantis still lacks is precisely that process. Small evidence building step by step toward an extraordinary conclusion. So far, that chain has not appeared. The ocean still contains large, unexplored areas, and future research may absolutely discover more prehistoric settlements, submerged harbors, and ancient coastlines. But the ocean still contains unknowns is not the same as saying Atlantis must be hiding among them. Unknown simply means unknown. It is not automatic evidence for any particular legend. A reliable search has to preserve curiosity and skepticism at the same time. Why, then, has Atlantis survived so strongly in popular memory when so many ancient legends have faded? One reason is that, from the beginning, it combines several of the most powerful forms of human imagination at once. It resembles a lost paradise because the land is almost impossibly rich. It resembles an imperial epic because it has royal dynasties, fleets, and war. It resembles a disaster film because an entire country vanishes in a short time. It resembles a historical mystery because the story insists it preserves a much older memory. And at the most important moment, the judgment of the gods, the text leaves a blank. Almost every later generation can find a part of the story it wants to continue. After the 19th century, Atlantis undergoes another transformation. It is no longer simply an ancient maritime empire. It is increasingly presented as the mother of world civilization. Similar buildings, flood traditions, and ancient knowledge in different parts of the world are explained as the work of survivors who escaped Atlantis and carried technology and culture to other continents. The idea spreads so easily because it offers one simple answer to many difficult questions. But simple answers can hide real history. Different civilizations can independently build monumental structures because gravity and building materials impose similar constraints. People living beside rivers and coasts experience floods, so flood traditions can emerge independently in many cultures. Agriculture, metallurgy, calendars, and navigation can develop in different regions for different reasons. Attributing every major achievement to a lost mother civilization underestimates the creativity of Egypt, Mesopotamia, the Americas, East Asia, and other ancient societies. Mystical traditions then add even more. Crystals, secret energy, telepathy, ancient superweapons, aircraft, and contact with extraterrestrial civilizations gradually become part of the popular image. By the age of movies, animation, and games, Atlantis is almost standardized into a world of blue underwater light, golden temples, glowing machines, and a giant power core. Visually, it is compelling. Historically, it is moving farther and farther from the earliest account. The earliest Atlantis is good at digging canals, building bridges, constructing harbors, mining, irrigating, making ships, organizing armies, and maintaining a vast alliance. In other words, it is not powerful, because it possesses futuristic supertech. It is powerful because it takes the resources and institutional capabilities imaginable for an ancient state and pushes them to an extreme. In some ways, that version is more unsettling. It says a civilization does not need science fiction weapons to lose its direction while succeeding. The earliest Atlantis story is not really saying the more advanced the technology, the more dangerous the civilization. Its point is different. The more capability a society possesses, the more restraint it requires. People with little capacity may dream of enormous ambitions and still be unable to carry them out. A society with huge resources, armies, and institutions can magnify the consequences of losing its limits very quickly. The tragedy of Atlantis is not that it has too much. It is that it no longer knows how much is enough. That is why Atlantis remains dramatic even after every piece of mystical technology and modern invention is removed. A sea god falls in love with a mortal woman and creates concentric rings around her home. 10 sons establish 10 kingdoms. 10 kings stand before fire and blood and swear obedience to law. The city grows generation after generation, while its harbors roar day and night. Wealth increases, and ambition grows with it. A vast fleet sails into the Mediterranean and is defeated by a power that seems weaker. The gods prepare to judge the empire, and the ancient text abruptly breaks off. Then, in one day and night, the island disappears. The story already contains origin, growth, a golden age, corruption, war, judgment, catastrophe, and mystery. It does not need a spaceship added to it. If we follow the evidence all the way to the end, we still return to an unavoidable fact. The earliest and most complete continuous ancient account that gives Atlantis an origin, 10 kings, a city, a war, and a sinking comes from the age of Plato. We do not possess an older Egyptian king list naming the 10 rulers. We do not have an independent inscription recording them. We do not have a second archive from a contemporary state saying, "We once fought Atlantis." That does not automatically prove the entire story is fiction. But it does mean we have to approach it with great caution. A real ancient empire large enough to wage wars across regions would normally be expected to leave traces in more than one source. Trade leaves objects. War affects neighboring states. Migration leaves cultural evidence. Rule leaves institutional or linguistic influence. The more powerful Atlantis is described as being, the stronger that expectation becomes. An empire with a giant fleet and broad territories should cast shadows in more than one place. So far, we have not found enough evidence to make those shadows converge on a single Atlantean empire. On the other hand, the story's specificity cannot simply be dismissed with the phrase, "someone made it up." Creating a philosophical tale does not require an author to abandon reality. In fact, convincing stories usually use familiar things. Ancient Greeks understood harbors, warships, earthquakes, and maritime power. Egypt represented extreme antiquity in their imagination. The Western Ocean represented distance and uncertainty. Combining real experiences like these could produce a world that felt both unfamiliar and believable. More importantly, the age in which the story was told had itself witnessed the rise and fall of sea power. Athens had built enormous influence on fleets and alliances and had projected power far from home. Then war changed everything. Defeat, political instability, and internal conflict showed people that a seemingly powerful city-state had no guarantee of permanence. Atlantis, growing richer, building a stronger navy, expanding farther, and finally failing after losing restraint, would not have felt entirely disconnected from contemporary experience with empire and power. That also helps explain why the ancient Athens in the story is portrayed as almost the opposite kind of state. It does not display wealth as its highest virtue. It emphasizes discipline. It is not presented as seeking expansion, but as resisting it. It continues fighting even after allies fall away. The real historical Athens was far more complicated and made imperial choices of its own. For that reason, the two societies in the story can be read almost like two mirrors. One shows what an ideal Athens ought to be, while the other magnifies sea power, wealth, and expansion into their most dangerous form. From that perspective, Atlantis is not merely a location. It is a thought experiment about civilization. Imagine giving a country extraordinary resources, grain, metals, timber, and water. Then give it institutions capable of keeping 10 kingdoms together. Then give it ports and fleets capable of changing the balance of the wider world. Now ask one question: what happens if even a country like that loses restraint? The story's answer is war and destruction. That also explains why Atlantis is not portrayed as evil from birth. If the only goal were to create a villain, the 10 kings could have been written as tyrants from the beginning. But that would make the story simpler and much shallower. Its real power comes from making you admire Atlantis first. You envy its water. You marvel at its harbors. You respect its institutions. You may even think the early kings are worthy of admiration. Only after you have accepted that this is an impressive civilization does the story begin to change it. That kind of change feels closer to real history than a society that is simply evil from day one. Nations do not suddenly replace their souls. Societies rarely transform from restraint to greed in a single night. The change is usually hidden inside repeated success. One generation does something earlier generations would not have done, and nothing terrible happens. The next generation sees that there were no consequences and treats the act as normal. The generation after that may forget the older norm ever existed. Decades later, the original boundary has moved far away, while the people living in the present simply say, "This is how we have always done things." What makes Atlantis frightening is exactly how gradual that process is. The final sinking takes one day. The path toward it takes generations. By the time the earthquake arrives, no one has time to change anything. The moments when the direction could still have changed came much earlier. When the palace first began treating luxury as glory, when the fleet first began treating expansion as inevitable, when the 10 kings first began placing power above law. The catastrophe only compresses a long transformation into one visible ending. That is why reducing the destruction to divine punishment misses one of the deepest layers of the story. Divine judgment is certainly part of the ancient narrative, but the gods do not simply become angry for no reason. The story spends a long time showing how the state has changed before punishment arrives. In other words, the chain of cause and effect does not come only from heaven. It begins among human beings. Atlantis first changes through its choices, and only afterward disappears in catastrophe. Likewise, it is not enough to reduce the story to a natural disaster. If the whole point were merely an earthquake and a flood, there would be no need to spend so much time on the laws of the 10 kings, the changing meaning of wealth, and the wars of conquest. Those elements exist to give the sinking moral and political weight. Water can destroy a city. It cannot, by itself, turn that city into a civilization-wide warning remembered for more than 2,000 years. Atlantis survives because people feel that its destruction happened not only to the land, but to the values of the society long before the sea arrived. And yet, if we treat it as nothing more than a moral allegory, we lose the historical texture that makes it convincing. The ancient Mediterranean really did have maritime powers. Major hydraulic works, earthquakes, tsunamis, volcanic disasters, and states destroyed by war. The fascination of Atlantis comes from the way those real ingredients are woven together with philosophical construction. It is difficult to prove that one specific disaster supplied one detail, or one real city supplied one architectural image. But taken as a whole, the story has a constant feeling of something that could almost have happened. That is one reason the search has never completely ended. If Atlantis violated everything people knew about the ancient world, it would have faded into pure mythology. If one archaeological site matched the entire description perfectly, the mystery would have ended long ago. Instead, Atlantis sits in between. Earthquakes are real. Tsunamis are real. Sunken cities are real. Prosperous Bronze Age island cultures are real. But those real pieces never quite assemble into the complete Atlantis of the story. Every new discovery seems to offer the final missing piece, until closer study shows that the shape does not quite fit. That state of being almost right may be Atlantis' greatest source of longevity. Santorini resembles the disaster, but the location is wrong. The waters west of Gibraltar fit the direction, but not the scale. Southwestern Spain has wealthy ancient cultures, but no complete match. The giant rings in North Africa look extraordinary, but they are natural geology. The Atlantic seafloor really does contain immense mountain ranges, but they are not the remains of a drowned continent. Every candidate lights up one part of the story. None lights up all of it at once. The most mature way to look at Atlantis, then, may not be to force a choice between 100% historical and 100% invented. It may be a story built from multiple echoes of reality. Perhaps one earthquake contributed the mechanism of destruction. Perhaps a real maritime society contributed the image of prosperity. Perhaps stories of Western trade contributed the geography. Perhaps the imperial experience of Athens contributed the political theme. Put all of those things into one furnace, and what emerges is not an archival record, but a literary empire larger than any single real-world prototype. Draw the entire story into one continuous line, and there are almost no breaks. First, Poseidon receives an island in the ocean and creates rings of land and water, along with hot and cold springs for Cleito. Their 10 sons establish 10 kingdoms, with Atlas as supreme king. 4 generations. The rulers preserve order through common law, and the island begins to develop. Bridges, canals, harbors, temples, palaces, and the Great Plain are steadily improved. Trade expands, the population grows, the military becomes stronger, and the fleet reaches farther. Then wealth changes values. Values change politics. Politics changes the direction of war. Atlantis turns its extraordinary organizational power toward conquest. Ancient Athens defeats it. Earthquakes and floods follow, and the island disappears. The whole process feels like a river gathering speed. The first half is construction. The second half is loss of control. The most interesting part is that Atlantis may still look prosperous at the very moment its destruction has already begun in a deeper sense. It does not become poor before it becomes dangerous. It becomes rich and then changes. It does not fall into chaos before it loses the war. Its institutions are still functioning when it takes the wrong direction. The palace may be more magnificent than in the age of the ancestors. The harbor may be busier than ever. The fleet may be the largest in the history of the island. If you lived at that time, you might sincerely believe you were witnessing the greatest golden age your country had ever known. That is why the Atlantis story remains more compelling than a simple disaster legend. The truly frightening possibility is not that a country visibly decays, but that it carries the seeds of its ending while it is at its most dazzling. Once the water actually enters the city, everyone knows disaster has arrived. The harder thing is recognizing that the state has changed while the sea is still far beyond the horizon. Real turning points rarely come with thunder. They may look like one more luxurious building project, one more expansion explained as necessary, one more war everyone assumes will be easy to win. Now bring the camera back to the royal city on its final peaceful night. The outer harbor is still full of light. Ships crowd the docks. Sailors shout. Craftsmen continue repairing hulls. People cross the bridges. Warehouses are packed with goods. Water still runs through the canals of the plain, and the hot and cold springs continue to rise. The racecourse has grown quiet, but the palace and temples still glow in firelight. The great statue of Poseidon looks down over the central zone. The laws of the ancestors are still carved into the sacred pillar. Everything is still there. If you saw only that one night, it would be difficult to believe the city could disappear. But the story has already told us that the end is close. The important question is no longer how many walls, ships, or medals Atlantis possesses. It is that the spirit which once held the civilization together has already changed. The ancestors believed strong people must restrain themselves. Their descendants increasingly believe strength is itself a justification. The ancestors used law to limit desire. Their descendants allow desire to reinterpret the law. The city outside has not yet collapsed, but its direction within has already shifted. Then the fleet sails. War begins. The empire loses. And after that, the earth shakes and the sea comes in. The waterways, harbors, and bridges that had once been the city's greatest achievements lose their meaning in the face of catastrophe. A nation made wealthy by the ocean is finally ended by the ocean. The symmetry is so complete that, whatever real-world sources may lie behind it, the story already possesses the structure of legend. More than 2,000 years later, people still look for Atlantis in the sea, in deserts, in volcanic craters, on ancient maps, and in satellite images. Perhaps future discoveries will uncover new submerged cities. Perhaps some ancient catastrophe will one day be shown to have influenced the story. Perhaps no single location will ever match every detail. But one point is already clear. What Atlantis left behind is not a map with a reliable set of coordinates. It is a trajectory showing how a civilization can change. A civilization may begin with restraint because it has only recently become wealthy and still remembers that wealth was difficult to obtain. Once wealth becomes normal, possession begins to feel natural. As wealth keeps growing, growth itself can become the goal. When growth reaches a boundary, the simplest solution is to move the boundary outward. When expansion keeps succeeding, success begins to prove that expansion must be right. Eventually, the society forgets why it ever needed restraint in the first place. Atlantis tells that process in a form more vivid than many theories of politics ever could. If we set every debate aside and spend a full day walking through Atlantis, it becomes easier to understand why the story refuses to leave the imagination. Start at dawn in the outer mountains. Water runs through rivers and artificial channels toward the plain. Farmers inspect irrigation. Herdsmen move animals. Harvested crops are taken to the water's edge. Timber comes down from the highlands, is loaded onto small vessels, and begins moving toward the capital. As the sun rises, more boats enter the network of canals. The plain operates like a giant supply machine, continuously sending food, wood, and people toward the city. Before noon, the outer harbor is an entirely different world. Ships from distant seas have just docked. Tax collectors and inspectors board first. Then workers begin unloading cargo. Nearby, shipwrights patch damaged planks, replace ropes, and stack newly made oars beside warehouse doors. People from different kingdoms speak with different accents, but they work inside the same port system. Farther away, military vessels and merchant ships occupy different areas. Horses are led down from transports. Soldiers cross the bridges toward training grounds, follow the main waterway inward, and the atmosphere changes gradually. In the outer districts, there are more people, more noise, and an air mixed with salt, sawdust, livestock, and food. Closer to the center, the streets become more orderly, the buildings taller, and the reflected light from metal-covered walls more intense. You pass baths with steam rising from warm springs. You pass training grounds where chariots and cavalry practice. You notice that the roads leading into the innermost rings are guarded more heavily. By evening, the sun is setting over the sea, and the palace and temple begin to glow in torchlight. White, black, and red stone takes on different shades as the light changes. Gold, silver, and reddish metal reflect warm color. Ritual preparations may be underway in the sanctuary, but the outer harbor is still awake. The last merchant ships hurry in before darkness. Taverns and warehouses remain crowded. The ancient description emphasizes that the harbor was filled day and night with the sound of ships and people. Atlantis was not a city that displayed prosperity only in daylight. Like a true metropolis, it kept working after sunset. If you saw only this ordinary day, nothing would tell you that destruction was inevitable. Fields are being irrigated. Taxes are being collected. Orders are leaving the palace. Soldiers are training. A person living there would probably assume tomorrow would look the same, and next year would look the same, and that his children would one day see an even larger city. One of civilization's most powerful illusions is the ability to make today's order look like a law of nature. If something continues long enough, people begin to believe it cannot stop. But history is cruel precisely because stability is never a guarantee. The people of Santorini did not know in advance that a volcano would transform their island. The people of Helike did not know that an earthquake would end the city they knew. Real catastrophes repeatedly remind us that infrastructure, wealth, and political order exist only while the natural environment allows them to. Atlantis takes that vulnerability to an extreme and makes an entire empire disappear with its island. Yet the story adds another layer beyond natural disaster. It does not only say nature is powerful, it also says prosperity changes people. That gives the final day of Atlantis two completely different countdowns. The first is a natural countdown. No one knows when the earthquake will come. The second is a political countdown. The state began moving in the wrong direction years earlier, while many people kept interpreting that movement as success. The first countdown is beyond human control. The second might have been changed. That is why later searches for Atlantis so easily focus entirely on the first countdown. People look for volcanoes, faults, tsunamis, and drowned coastlines because those can be located on a map and measured scientifically. But the story spends more time describing the second transformation, how the 10 kings once respected law, how wealth gradually became more important, and how a prosperous state turned toward expansion. The mystery of the location is fascinating. The change in values is the real skeleton of the story. That does not mean searching for a location is meaningless. Quite the opposite. If we could identify real historical sources behind the tale, we would learn more about how ancient societies preserved memories of disaster and more about early civilizations around the Mediterranean and Atlantic coasts. But a serious search has to begin with verification, not belief. First, ask what the evidence says. Then ask whether it corresponds to the story. Do not decide in advance that a place must be Atlantis and explain every mismatch by saying the ancients remembered it wrong. Chronology, for example, is one of the hardest problems. The story's 9,000-year figure pushes Atlantis back to around 10,000 BCE. Human beings certainly lived in complex communities and long-term settlements at that time, and the post-Ice Age environment was changing rapidly. But no Mediterranean civilization has yet been found from that period that combines a giant city, a mature state, large-scale metal use, and a far-ranging maritime empire. To make Bronze Age candidates fit, some researchers suggest that the 9,000 years may have been corrupted in transmission and perhaps originally meant 900. That possibility cannot be ruled out simply because ancient numbers can indeed be copied incorrectly. But if we use that argument, we have to apply the same standard consistently. We cannot say the number must be wrong whenever the date is inconvenient, then insist another number must be exact whenever it supports a theory. We cannot claim ancient memory was precise when geography helps us, but dismiss it as allegory when another detail does not fit. Any serious proposal needs a set of rules that works the same way across the entire text. Scale creates the same problem. The ancient words translated as Libya and Asia do not correspond exactly to the full modern continents of Africa and Asia, so we should not simply add modern continental areas together. Even so, the story clearly intends Atlantis to be very large. It contains not only a city, but an enormous plain, mountains, rivers, forests, and 10 kingdoms. A small island that happens to have suffered a volcanic disaster must explain the huge difference in scale. A large region with no evidence of the required maritime empire must explain where the cultural evidence is. The concentric rings present the same issue. They are visually irresistible, which is why modern searchers focus on them so often. But read the original description as a whole, and the rings are only part of the royal capital. Beyond them lie the Great Plain, the mountains, and the wider empire. Finding a ring-shaped landscape and declaring Atlantis discovered would be like finding one wall in a desert and announcing that the entire palace has been located. Shape can provide a clue. It cannot replace the city. Historical verification works by placing barriers in front of romantic conclusions. That may sound as if it makes the story less exciting. In practice, the opposite is often true. Every time a simple answer fails, Atlantis becomes more complicated. Santorini shows us how terrifying a real volcanic catastrophe can be. Helike shows that ancient Greeks really did know of a city destroyed by the sea. Sea level research shows that prehistoric communities truly lost land. Atlantic geology explains why an entire continent dropping into the deep ocean overnight is difficult. None of these answers find Atlantis, but each teaches us more about the real world. That may be one of the most valuable things about the search. Atlantis acts like a doorway, connecting subjects people might otherwise never explore. Start with a legend, and you soon encounter Greek politics, Egyptian culture, Bronze Age archaeology, volcanology, tsunami science, plate tectonics, ancient shorelines, deep-sea mapping, and pseudo-archaeology. Someone may begin with the simple question, where is the city? And with a much larger map of civilization and the history of the Earth. Atlantis itself becomes even stranger in the process. The more we learn about real history, the harder it is to believe the extravagant super technology versions. Yet the more we learn about real disasters, the easier it is to understand why ancient people might imagine a drowned civilization. The more we learn about geology, the harder it is to accept a continent sinking overnight. Yet the more we learn about post-ice age sea level rise, the more clearly we see that humans really did lose vast areas of land. Atlantis remains suspended between this feels possible and the details still do not match. Perhaps that is exactly the position that allows it to survive for more than 2,000 years. Things that are completely proven become history. Things that become entirely impossible may slowly retreat into pure myth. Atlantis remains between the two. Reality keeps offering new parallels, but never the final evidence. Every generation gets to begin the search again, and every generation seems to stop one step short. So the question returns to the beginning. What are we actually searching for? If the target is a giant 10-king empire that existed exactly as described in the ancient story, no evidence today proves that such an empire existed. If the target is the real disasters and historical materials that may have inspired the story, there may be more than one source. Volcanoes, earthquakes, maritime trade, Western geographical imagination, and Athenian imperial experience could all have contributed something. Atlantis may not be one missing puzzle piece. It may be many real pieces rearranged into an entirely new picture. If the only question is, did it exist? The answer is less dramatic than many videos would suggest. No site has yet been jointly accepted by mainstream archaeology and geology as the complete Atlantis of the legend. The earliest surviving core narrative comes from texts of Plato's age, and the story clearly carries philosophical themes about states, wealth, power, and restraint. It may well incorporate real disasters, maritime trade, imperial warfare, and ancient geographical knowledge. But there is no evidence demonstrating that the complete federation of 10 kingdoms existed exactly as the story describes it. And yet, dismissing Atlantis as worthless because of that would make the story smaller than it is. Legend and history do not interact only through the categories completely true and completely false. A real eruption at Santorini could contribute to the imagination of catastrophe. The real destruction of Helike could reinforce fear of a city vanishing beneath water. Real maritime empires and wars could provide political experience. Egypt's reputation for antiquity could make the frame of ancient records feel more credible. A story can be built from real fragments without the final whole ever having existed in reality. The real danger is mixing the story with the evidence. Atlantis can be mysterious, but mystery is not proof. It can have historical inspirations, but an inspiration is not the same as a complete state. It can have many candidate locations, but a candidate is not a discovery. The more we enjoy the story, the more important it is to keep those boundaries clear. Once the exaggerations are removed, what remains is actually more powerful, and the core that remains is very simple. A civilization receives exceptional land, resources, and organizational ability, and at first it understands restraint. It does not fail because it is poor. It does not fail because it is technologically backward. It does not fail because its enemy was always stronger. Its real transformation begins with values. First, wealth becomes more important. Then expansion becomes more reasonable. Finally, the state turns its greatest capacities toward the wrong goal. By the time failure arrives, the deeper changes have been accumulating for a long time. So perhaps the first true disaster of Atlantis is not the earthquake at all. The first disaster is when wealth becomes a value in itself. The second is when power becomes confused with justice. The third is when the empire begins to believe the world should be rearranged according to its own will. The sea is only the final disaster. By then, even the strongest walls cannot save it. That is why the story still holds our attention more than 2,000 years later. It is not because everyone literally believes a complete city is waiting on the ocean floor. It is because the danger it describes feels familiar. The more successful an organization becomes, the easier it is to treat success as proof that it cannot be wrong. The stronger a state becomes, the easier it is to confuse capability with legitimacy. The more prosperous an age becomes, the easier it is to assume prosperity will continue forever. Atlantis takes those risks, magnifies them to an extreme, and then sinks the entire island. Look again at the small hill where the story began, and you can see that the whole narrative completes a circle. Poseidon first uses rings of land and water to protect one family. Human beings later turn those rings into harbors. The harbors create wealth. The wealth supports fleets. The fleets encourage expansion. Expansion brings war. And after the war, water once again becomes the force of destruction. Atlantis receives everything from the sea and, in the end, loses everything to the sea. The one thing that does not sink is the question. As a civilization acquires more and more, can it still remember why restraint mattered in the first place? If the answer is no, the most dangerous moment may not be poverty, chaos, or defeat. It may be the moment when prosperity, strength, and confidence reach their highest point. That is when each mistake can be hidden by success. Each boundary crossed can be explained as evidence of ability, and each new expansion can be presented as something natural and deserved. So the part of Atlantis worth remembering most is not what might be hidden under the seabed. It is what happened before the water arrived. The final day did not truly decide the fate of Atlantis. The many years before that day did. A country does not suddenly become something else at the exact moment a wave hits the wall. It changes through countless small decisions that seem reasonable at the time, slowly moving away from what it once was. By the time everyone finally hears the sound of disaster, the most important choices have already been made. Perhaps that is why Atlantis refuses to disappear from human memory. It could be an ancient philosophical story. It could be a centuries-long mystery about a lost civilization. It could be a mirror held up to every age. Some people search for it beneath the sea. Some search in volcanic ash. Some search in old maps. But after more than 2,000 years, the Atlantis closest to us, and the easiest to overlook, is not a ruin on the seafloor. It is the road that leads from we have so much to we still need more. Look closely at the fate of Atlantis, and you can see that it passes through three very different transformations. The first is from nature to civilization. Poseidon's hill, springs, and rings of land and water are only the beginning. Human beings turn them into bridges, canals, harbors, palaces, and farmland. In this phase, Atlantis is creating. It turns natural advantages into social order, resources into cities, and 10 royal houses into a state. This is the period most worthy of admiration. The second transformation is from prosperity to empire. The harbors grow larger. Trade routes stretch farther. The military becomes more complete. A country that once needed only to defend its island gradually gains the ability to reach distant waters. Capability itself is neither good nor evil. But when capability repeatedly produces success, psychology begins to change. We can go there slowly becomes, we should go there. And then, why should that place not belong to us? There is no exact line separating those stages, which is why the shift is so dangerous. The third transformation is from empire to legend. Defeat and catastrophe end Atlantis inside the story, whether or not a real-world prototype ever existed. Yet once the island sinks, it is liberated from ordinary geography. A living state can occupy only one place. A sunken Atlantis can be placed anywhere by later generations. It can be in the Aegean. It can be in the Atlantic. It could be in Spain or North Africa. It can live in novels and films. Once one island disappears, it becomes countless islands. Taken together, these three transformations are the true, full life of Atlantis. It grows from mythical landscape into civilization, from civilization into empire, and from empire into shared human imagination. Many real states are slowly forgotten after they disappear. Atlantis does the opposite. The less firmly it exists on a map, the more powerfully it exists in culture. The sea erases the island from the world of the story and gives it a second life without borders. Perhaps that is why, whenever we talk about Atlantis, we unconsciously mix the search for ruins with the search for meaning. On the surface, people ask for coordinates. What really draws us in is another question. Why would a civilization that seemed so close to perfect still fail? If the answer were only because of an earthquake, the story would be simple. But the ancient narrative spends so much time before the earthquake talking about wealth, law, and war. Nature ends a story. Human choices make the ending meaningful. Place the early ritual of the 10 kings beside the final war, and the contrast is enormous. At first, the kings stand before the pillar of law and drink the sacrificial wine, knowing they must obey common rules. Their authority is limited even in disputes within the royal houses. Later, the whole empire attempts to decide whether other states should submit to it. The earliest political wisdom of Atlantis is limit power. Its later and most dangerous belief becomes use power. The change is never about whether Atlantis possesses strength. It is about a complete reversal in its attitude toward strength. The same contrast appears in wealth. The early rulers are not poor. The story gives them enormous resources from the beginning, so it does not equate poverty with virtue. The difference is that they once understood wealth as something secondary. Later, wealth becomes a measure of both national and personal worth. The problem is not having gold. The problem is when gold begins to tell you who you are. As the city uses more and more expensive materials to prove its greatness, it also changes how its people understand what greatness means. Architecture, therefore, takes on another meaning. The first bridge exists to connect. The first canal exists to carry ships. The first palace exists to govern. Over time, the same forms of construction begin to serve display. Walls must shine more brightly. Temples must become larger. Palaces must surpass those of previous generations. There is no easy date marking the moment a country moves from "we build because we need this" to "we build to prove how great we are." But once that shift occurs, the city is no longer just a place to live. It becomes a monument to collective desire. The harbor changes in the same way. At first, the harbor means exchange. It allows foreign goods to enter and local products to move outward. Later, it also means fleets can depart quickly. No harbor is evil by nature. The same channel can carry grain or soldiers. What determines its meaning is who gives the order and where the ships are sent. The story uses that transformation to make a larger point. Tools do not determine outcomes by themselves. Human beings determine what tools are used for. That is why the interpretation Atlantis was destroyed, because its technology became too advanced, is too simple. The story is closer to saying that the more capable a society becomes, the stronger its self-restraint must become as well. Greater capacity magnifies the consequences of wrong decisions. The ambition of a small state may harm only its neighbors. The wrong direction taken by an empire with enormous fleets and resources can drag an entire region into war. Technology and organization allow people to do more. That makes the question, should we, more important, not less. This is one reason modern audiences so often feel as though Atlantis is speaking to them. Our technology goes far beyond anything the ancient world could imagine. Transportation, energy, communication, and weapons amplify the capabilities of individuals and states on a scale unknown to earlier societies. In an age like ours, the old Atlantean question resonates easily. What happens if capability grows faster than judgment and restraint? That does not mean modern society is Atlantis. It means the story offers a very old lens through which to consider a very modern problem. But if we turn Atlantis only into a modern warning, we lose some of its most compelling historical character. Atlantis is still, first of all, a city imagined in ancient terms. Its power comes from oars and timber, from harbors, farmland, and military service, as people in the Bronze Age and classical world could understand them. Its kings sacrifice bulls in temples. They do not sit at consoles operating machines. Horses and chariots travel its roads, or its sailing vessels fill its ports. Harvests on the plain depend on canals. Those ancient details keep Atlantis from becoming a generic science fiction world with an old name pasted onto it. It feels like an empire grown from the imagination of Mediterranean civilization. If a gigantic ancient city is discovered beneath the sea someday, we may have to revisit some details. If no such city is ever found, the story will still retain its power. Its most important part has never depended on coordinates. Atlantis survives because every time people retell the arc of its rise and fall, they recognize something in it. We are drawn to the circular city. We are shocked by the destruction in a single day and night. But what often remains longest in the mind is a simpler question. If they already had so much, why could they not stop wanting more? That is why the ending should not stop at, so, have we found it? If Atlantis were only an unsolved location mystery, then the lack of an answer would mean the story remains unfinished. But Atlantis is not like that. The location question remains open, while the story itself is complete. It moves from birth to prosperity, from prosperity to arrogance, from arrogance to war, and from war to destruction. We can see why each step is more dangerous than the one before it. We can see how early advantages later become tools that magnify risk. The water Poseidon created first protects Cleito, then becomes the transportation system of a city, then supports a maritime empire, and finally becomes the symbol of destruction. The political system of the 10 kings first limits power, then later enables an enormous empire to coordinate with great efficiency. The island's abundant resources first free its people from scarcity, then give later rulers confidence that they can continue expanding. Almost every advantage in the story develops another side. That structure makes Atlantis more than a simple story of something good turning bad. It becomes a story of a civilization amplifying its own strengths until, once those strengths are no longer controlled, they turn against it. At first, they control water. In the end, the water cannot be controlled. At first, they command wealth. Later, wealth redefines them. At first, they organize power. Later, power begins determining their direction. At first, they build laws to prevent kingship from escaping its limits. Later, they use the capacity of the entire state to make others submit. None of these changes appears from nowhere. Each grows out of something that was once an advantage. That is the complete tragedy of Atlantis. If there is one clear conclusion to leave behind, it is this. The existence of Atlantis in the complete form described by the ancient story has never been proven. But the trajectory of civilization described by that story feels real enough that it is difficult to ignore. Resources produce prosperity. Prosperity produces confidence. Confidence becomes superiority. Superiority becomes expansion. Expansion makes the entire state increasingly dependent on power. In the end, a civilization that once understood restraint can no longer hear the oldest lesson left by its ancestors. Being powerful does not mean you are allowed to do everything. And when a civilization can no longer hear that lesson, its sinking has already begun. The sea has not arrived yet. The city is still bright. The palace still shines. Cargo is still being moved through the harbor. The fleet still sits in orderly formation. People may even be celebrating another victory. On the surface, everything looks better than before. But the most dangerous change has already happened somewhere people cannot easily see. The frightening thing about Atlantis is not that it finally sinks beneath the sea. It is that, on the way toward the sea, it looks almost unbelievably successful, and that is where the story of Atlantis ends. I'm Jason from Eastern Historian. I'll see you in the next episode.